friendship with Oliver Stone. He bought the rights to my he bought the rights to one chapter of my first book, and we sold a show idea together to the History Channel that they never made. But we became friendly and remained friendly. And he put me on the spot one day. I was in his office, and he said to me, you're not one of those guys that doesn't believe that the CIA killed Kennedy, are you? And I said, I think there were probably elements of the CIA that were involved in killing Kennedy, but in terms of being a CIA operation to kill Kennedy, no, I've never believed that. He said, you're so full of shit. And I said, no, I genuinely, I don't believe that the CIA killed Kennedy. And he said, who do you think killed Kennedy? I said, it was probably George Ioannidis, who was kind of a rogue CIA officer stationed in Miami. He was very close to the Cubans. And I think that we probably should take a closer look at him. But I said at the same time, I don't think we've really gotten to the bottom of where the mob was on all this. And I said, we hear these stories about Carlos Marcello. We hear stories about Santo Trafficante and the things that they said in the immediate aftermath, like we finally got him, and then the ties between Chicago and Jack Ruby. I said, I just don't think that's ever been fully investigated. He got genuinely angry with me that I didn't just agree with him. Yes, the CIA killed Kennedy. Well, I later struck up a friendly acquaintanceship. We're not friends, but a friendly acquaintanceship with Bobby Kennedy Jr. And he and I started talking about this one time. And he said something that I told him in response. I said, this is historical. You should write this down, because I think the American people need to hear your recollections. He said, on the day that his uncle was killed, November 22nd, 1963, his mom picked him up at school early. It was like 2:30. It was minutes after the assassination. And they drove back to their home in McLean, Virginia. It was called Hickory Hill. It was a glorious, 40-acre spread with a mansion on the top of the hill. And when they pulled into the driveway, his dad was standing there talking to John McCone. John McCone was the director of the CIA. The Kennedys and the McCones were very, very close. They were both devoutly Catholic. And then 6 months earlier, Mrs. McCone died of breast cancer. And the Kennedys were genuinely worried that John McCone might do something to harm himself. And so they had him over to dinner 7 nights a week just to keep an eye on him. And then after dinner, he and Bobby Kennedy Sr. would go swimming together. So Bobby Jr. and his mom pull into the driveway. He gets out of the car. He's walking past his dad, and he's looking at his dad. And he hears his dad say to McCone, tell me your people didn't do this. And McCone says, I don't know who did it. He didn't say, wow, of course my people didn't do it. Why would you even ask such a thing like that? He said, I don't know who did it. So he said he always believed it was the CIA. I always believed it was elements of the CIA. But I'm coming up to my most important point. So I have a friend who is close to the president, and I said to him at the time that the documents were released, about a year ago, I said, thank God that the president finally released the remaining documents. And he said, no, he didn't. I said, yeah, he did. He was compelled by law. Congress passed a law twice compelling the president to release all documents related to the Kennedy assassination. He said, there are 10,000 documents that are never going to be released. And I said, why? And he said, because every single one of them points directly at Israel. And I said, oh man, that's not one that I was thinking of. He says that the Israelis were so angry that A, John Kennedy wouldn't give them nuclear technology, but more importantly, B, he was actively trying to disrupt the Israelis from acquiring nuclear technology, and they decided they had to take him out. Very little known, small cemetery in very far upper northwest, not even northwest, it's right on the northwest-northeast line at the very top of North Capitol Street.
So another block and you're in Maryland. And it's called the Old Soldiers and Sailors Home National Cemetery. So there's a nursing home there that was set up during the Civil War for people who had like lost legs and couldn't care for themselves. And when they died, they were buried in the cemetery next to the nursing home. There are like 23 or 27 Congressional Medal of Honor winners there. They weren't very interesting to me because you go on the Medal of Honor website and it's like, killed lots of Indians, killed lots of Indians, killed lots of Indians. Well, that's just not interesting. So I'm wandering around the cemetery, and there are about 15,000 burials there, which is quite small for a cemetery. There's one woman. One. So I was like, well, who's this woman? Agnes Bukowski. Maybe she was just married to the guy in charge. Maybe she's nobody. So I started to research her. Oh my God, what a fascinating story. It turns out she was married to the guy who ran the place. That's why she's there. But that has nothing to do with her story. She was born in 1897 in Washington and wanted to become a librarian. And the First World War broke out. And her parents said, maybe you shouldn't be a librarian. Maybe you should be a nurse. She said, yeah, that's probably a better idea. So she goes to Bellevue Hospital in New York City, the famous Bellevue Hospital. Now it's a mental institution. They had a nursing program there, and she became a nurse. And as soon as she graduated, she joined the Red Cross, and they sent her to Italy to care for severely wounded American soldiers. And as soon as she arrived, she was assigned to care for a severely wounded American ambulance driver by the name of Ernest Hemingway, who she called Ernie, 19 years old. And they immediately began a torrid affair that lasted for 4 months. And then she broke up with him. And she married an Italian lieutenant. Well, by then Hemingway had recovered and was transferred out. They never spoke to each other ever again. But in 1926, he wrote his first short story. He published his first short story. And she's the lead character. And then in 1932, he published The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and she's the lead character again. And then his masterpiece, A Farewell to Arms, she's the lead character. And it turned out that she's the lead character in 6 of his books. She later went on to divorce the Italian, and she married this American colonel who was in charge of the nursing home. Ernest Hemingway committed suicide in, I think it was 1958, 62, something like that, 62 maybe. And a year later, his brother called her and said, I'm writing a book called My Brother Ernest Hemingway, and I'd like to interview you for the book. She said, how do you know that I knew your brother? I never told anybody. I never even told my husbands. And he said that Hemingway never stopped talking about her, that she was the only woman he had ever loved. He had 4 failed marriages. He was a notorious alcoholic and he was abusive to all of his wives. But she was the only one that he had ever loved. And so the brother went up to Washington and interviewed her. She gave him pictures of them sitting on his hospital bed while he was recuperating and love letters that they had exchanged. And she had kept a scrapbook. Every time he was in a newspaper, she would cut out the article. And she said her husband just always thought she was a Hemingway fan.
No way.
And so the picture, the love letters, and the scrapbook are now in the Hemingway Museum in Key West, Florida. And now people know who Agnes Bukowski is. Yeah, I could see that through the first arrest even. But then he had to have concluded that things were so bad in 2019 that this was it. It was over. You know?
Why? Why do you say that?
Because he killed himself.
You do believe he did?
I do. I believe he killed himself.
What makes you believe that, considering all the evidence that they have?